What if the fate of an entire continent could be compressed into a single phone call in the dead of night? At 3:17 a.m., a voice from Tel Aviv pierced the silence over Ouagadougou. It was Benjamin Netanyahu, measured unyielding, issuing an ultimatum to Captain Ibrahim Traore, 48 hours to restore Israeli mining concessions, to revive broken surveillance pacts, to undo every act of defiance against foreign control. The choices laid before him were exile or surrender. Those who later replayed the recording described the cadence as imperial, the words dripping with the arrogance of empire. But for Traoré, it was not a summons to fear, it was the sharpening of an old resolve, the clarity of a soldier who had stood against the impossible in the Sahel and endured. Across the dimly lit room, the map of Burkina Faso stretched like a provocation, a small landlocked nation, 22 million lives, no nuclear deterrent, no powerful allies. And yet there it stood, a reminder that dignity once embraced can outweigh entire arsenals. The clock was already ticking. 48 hours to decide whether Africa would still kneel when foreign voices demanded obedience. When the line finally went silent, the stillness clung to the air like smoke after an explosion. The ultimatum had been delivered, 48 hours to bend or be broken. Netanyahu had spoken as though Burkina Faso were nothing more than a pawn on someone else's chessboard, a colony to be commanded. Yet the president did not waver. Instead, he called for his most trusted circle. By 4 in the morning, the crisis chamber was alive with fluorescent light. The defense minister, the intelligence chief, the advisor for foreign affairs, all dragged from their beds, now sat gathered around the heavy oak table. Their eyes carried fatigue, but also the fierce anticipation of people who understood they were standing at the edge of history. In the middle of the table, a small recorder replayed the Israeli prime minister's voice. The message could not be misunderstood. Restore our contracts, abandon your office, or be removed by force. The silence afterward pressed heavier than the Sahel night outside. It was the defense minister who finally broke it. "This is not negotiation," he said bluntly. "This is regime change by telephone." His tone carried the rough certainty of a soldier who knew the pattern: first, the ultimatum, then the destabilization, and finally the collapse. The intelligence chief leaned forward, his notes spread before him. For weeks, his teams had detected unusual signals: foreign satellites circling more frequently overhead, hackers probing government servers, shadowy financial transfers routed through offshore accounts. Now he laid the evidence out in black and white. They've been setting the stage. If you resign, they'll crown their puppet. If you resist, they will unleash chaos. The president listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the maps of the Sahel covering the walls. He remembered older battles fought against mercenaries and extremists. Back then, the weapons had been rifles and dusty pickup trucks. Now the arsenal was hidden economic strangulation, digital infiltration, propaganda campaigns, and diplomatic isolation. Different tools, same goal: control, submission, the breaking of a people's will. "Options?" he asked at last, his voice calm, but edged with steel. The foreign affairs advisor spoke hesitantly. "We could yield. Step aside, install someone they approve, and pray they allow safe passage." His words poisoned the air. Everyone in the room understood what it meant: the burial of sovereignty, the erasure of the movement that had carried him into power, the return of plunder dressed as partnership. Never, the president answered instantly, his voice unshakable. "What else?" The defense minister's face darkened. "Then we stand firm. We prepare for a different kind of war, not fought with tanks, but with economies, with stories, with systems. A battle of endurance and of truth." The weight of his words settled over the room. Burkina Faso was small, landlocked, far from rich. Yet history had proven that size and weapons do not decide every fight. Sometimes the refusal to kneel is the sharpest blade. Sometimes the first blow is simply the courage to say no. The president rose and walked to the great map of his nation, his hand pressed against its outline from the northern deserts to the southern rivers. His voice was steady, burning with memory and conviction. "They still believe it is 1960, he said, "that Africans must leap when foreign masters snap their fingers, that our people's trust weighs less than their approval. They are wrong." He turned back to his council. "We will not bow. We will not trade sovereignty for safety. Instead, we will show them the price of threatening the wrong people at the wrong moment." The intelligence chief nodded, already sketching contingency plans, securing encrypted lines, shielding the power grid, isolating the financial system from sabotage. The defense minister listed measures against unrest seeded by outside agents. The foreign affairs advisor, though shaken, now saw a wider horizon. This was no longer one country's struggle. It was Africa itself insisting on the right to breathe free. By sunrise, the machinery of resistance was already in motion. Secure calls went out to Caracas, Moscow, Tehran, Beijing. Not pleas for mercy, but declarations of defiance. They demand I surrender, the president told each counterpart. I refuse. Will you stand with us when the storm breaks? Replies came quickly: offers of cyber defense trade agreements, discreet security assistance if the crisis escalated. Fragile threads of solidarity, but threads nonetheless weaving a network of resistance. Yet the most important call would not leap across oceans. It would rise from the soil of Burkina Faso itself. For when news of the ultimatum spread not from whispers in the palace, but from the lips of those boasting of their pressure, the nation would awaken. Foreign powers had their weapons, but the fury of a people stripped of dignity could become the strongest weapon of all. As the council adjourned, the president looked again at the ticking clock. The 48 hours were already dissolving. But in that room, something larger than time had been born: the Council of Resistance, a circle that chose defiance over compliance, sovereignty over fear. The countdown no longer belonged to Netanyahu. It now belonged to history itself, waiting to see if a small nation in Africa could stare down the empire and refuse to bow. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the ultimatum was no longer a secret confined to the president's chamber. It had spilled into the arteries of the nation, pulsing through its systems, institutions, and daily life. The invisible weapons of modern coercion were many, and by the 30th hour of the countdown, they had all been unleashed. The opening strike fell upon the nation's financial heart. Banking screens froze without warning. Payrolls stalled. Accounts flashed errors that seemed like glitches, but were precise acts of sabotage. To ordinary citizens, it meant paychecks, vanishing markets, hesitating rumors swelling like wildfire. For the council, it was confirmation: the campaign of destabilization had begun. Almost on cue, the electrical grid began to buckle. Lights dimmed in entire districts, hospitals braced against sudden outages. Generators roared awake to keep ventilators running, to hold fragile lives on the edge of survival, while technicians raced to trace the fault lines. But it was no technical failure. It was sabotage crafted to spread fear, to whisper in every household that their government could not protect them. Then came the assault on communication. Internet speeds collapsed, phone calls carried strange echoes, and social media feeds drowned in fabricated images. A video showed the president boarding a jet with a suitcase. Another claimed ministers had called for his resignation. Forged documents, polished, stamped, and signed, appeared online, showing Swiss accounts filled with stolen wealth. Each lie was sharp enough to wound trust, each rumor timed like a strike against the nation's morale. Yet the council had not waited idly. Encrypted backups came online. Secondary communication lines crackled with new life. Teams of young analysts worked around the clock, debunking false videos within minutes, exposing the fingerprints of foreign studios behind them. Banks rerouted to backup systems, payrolls trickled once more. Solar grids and diesel reserves steadied the hospitals and command centers. The blows landed, but the nation did not fall. Still, the offensive raged on. Western media headlines fanned the chaos: Burkina Faso on the brink, democracy in retreat, authoritarianism rising in West Africa. These were not reports, they were weapons shaping narratives abroad, preparing the soil for foreign intervention. In Washington, London, Paris, think tanks rehearsed the old playbook: resistance is tyranny, surrender is reform. The president studied these broadcasts in silence, his jaw set. They are not trying to remove me alone, he finally said. They are trying to erase the very idea that Africa can say no. His words cut through the chamber like a blade. The intelligence chief confirmed the pattern. This was not a single front, it was a layered war: cyber strikes to disrupt infrastructure, economic sabotage, to stir unrest, propaganda to erode trust, in international framing to justify intervention. A 21st century blueprint for regime change practiced elsewhere, now directed at Ouagadougou. But while pressure mounted, something unexpected began to grow. Citizens started to notice the cracks in the lies. A video's shadow fell the wrong way. A forged document carried the wrong seal. A voice in a clip spoke with an accent foreign to their soil. Ordinary people armed with little more than pride and vigilance began debunking fakes themselves. Radio stations, the living heartbeat of the nation, broadcast corrections faster than rumors could spread. The avalanche of deception met the rock of popular awareness. By the 36th hour, the battle balanced on a knife's edge. Outside pressure screamed louder. New sanctions threatened, new ultimatums hinted. But inside the country, something deeper was stirring. Crowds swelled not in fear but in fury. Outside ministries' placards rose. 48 hours, try 48 years. Voices roared in unison. Our minerals are not for sale. Our democracy is not for export. The Foreign Affairs advisor, who only a day earlier had whispered the word compliance, now spoke with fire in his voice. This is larger than us. If we bow, every African leader will be told to bow. If we resist, we might fall, but if we succeed, we will redraw the map of power for a whole continent. The president nodded slowly but firmly. Then let history show we chose resistance. At that moment, the ultimatum stopped being a duel between two men. It became a collision of two visions, one built on obedience through invisible chains, the other on the belief that dignity can outlast even instability. Every hour tightened the web of pressure. Yet with every attempt to suffocate, Burkina Faso learned to breathe differently, to adapt, to fight back, to survive. The storm that was meant to crush its leader had instead awakened its people. And in markets and university courtyards and crowded alleys, a new whisper began to rise. If Burkina Faso can endure this, then Africa can too. The clock ticked toward the 40th hour. The machinery of coercion ground on, but so did the machinery of resilience. What had started as a midnight ultimatum had transformed into a continental question. Would Africa continue bowing to the architecture of intimidation, or would it finally unmistakably refuse? By the 40th hour of the ultimatum, the real counterforce had surfaced, not in secret files, not in the offices of foreign diplomats, but in the rising voices of everyday people. What started as murmurs over crackling radios had swelled into a thunderous roar echoing through the streets. Ouagadougou was no longer still. From first light until the sun fell again, waves of citizens poured toward the presidential palace. Some held hand-painted boards that shouted, "Traoré stays." Others unfurled banners declaring no foreign ultimatums. The air trembled with chants that rose like rolling drums. Our minerals are not for sale. Our sovereignty is not your property. This was not fear. It was fury sharpened into purpose. The ultimatum leaked by those who had meant to boast of their power had instead ignited defiance. Citizens who once argued policy or critiqued leaders now found themselves bound together by one unmistakable demand: resist. Market women abandoned their stalls, farmers rode in on buses, students marched to the beat of drums, and old veterans appeared in faded jackets, still carrying the scent of past battles. Each face bore the same expression: enough. They had endured decades of contracts that drained their soil, decades of surveillance that served outsiders, decades of presidents who bent at the first foreign call. This time they refused. Inside the palace, the president stood on a balcony, watching as a human sea stretched far beyond the horizon. He had braced for cyber sabotage, for electricity grids to falter, for isolation by foreign powers. What he had not fully anticipated was this: a spontaneous uprising of solidarity that transformed a threat against one man into the resolve of millions. The intelligence chief, who only days earlier had warned of destabilization, now spoke with disbelief, softened by awe. They sought to frighten us. Instead, they have awakened the nation. Across the countryside, radio stations carried the same defiance. In the north, villagers pledged, "If the president falls, we all fall. Let them come for us too." In the south, choirs lifted hymns reshaped by the moment. 48 hours have passed. 48 years we will stand. Even schoolyards echoed with young voices chanting slogans, their laughter and pride cutting through the tension like sunlight. The media campaign that was designed to divide the nation had done the opposite. Every fabricated video once exposed became proof of manipulation. Every forged document once debunked became fuel for rage. People who once trusted outside broadcasters now turned inward to their own radios, their own neighbors, their own eyes. Trust had migrated home. By the 42nd hour, the spirit had leapt across borders. Students in Ghana raised placards. An attack on Burkina Faso is an attack on Africa. Crowds in Mali and Niger denounced the ultimatum as nothing more than colonial echo. Across Francophone Africa, hashtags multiplied. No ultimatums, Narcos Africa, stands, non Traoré, stays. Even the African Union, often slow and hesitant, began to feel the ground shift. Leaders who had doubted the wisdom of resistance now felt the pulse of their citizens demanding solidarity. This was no longer Netanyahu against Traoré. It had become a clash between foreign dictate and African dignity. Within the council chamber, the defense minister's eyes burned with conviction. They thought the people would scatter. Instead, the people are the wall holding us firm. The president answered softly but with steel in his voice. No outsider has the right to appoint an African president. Tonight the world will hear it not from me, but from them. As dusk draped itself across the capital, torches lit the avenues. Drums pounded rhythms older than borders, older than nations. Ouagadougou became a living monument of defiance. Markets stayed open not out of necessity, but as a statement life will continue on African terms, not foreign terms. When midnight neared, the chant swelled into a tidal wave. 48 hours we do not kneel. Traoré stays, Africa resists, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Cape Town to Dakar. Images of the crowds raced across television screens and phone screens alike. What was meant to showcase Israel's power to dictate African politics had been flipped into a rallying cry. Netanyahu's deadline had backfired. He had given Africa 48 hours, and Africa had replied with a declaration: time itself belongs to those who refuse to surrender. The streets were awake now, and once awake, a people who had found their voice would never sleep again. By the 43rd hour, the ultimatum no longer resembled a duel between two men. What had begun as a midnight phone call had swelled into something far larger, a continental reckoning. Africa itself now hung in the balance, watching closely to see whether one small landlocked nation would be broken or whether it would ignite a new tradition of defiance. The first responses came from nearby capitals. Mali's president sent a message as blunt as it was powerful. If they can remove you for rejecting their contracts, they can remove any of us. We will not allow it. Niger's parliament passed urgent resolutions condemning foreign interference in African governance. Chad went further, announcing that its military command was on alert, signaling that any attempt at forced regime change in Burkina Faso would be seen as a provocation against the region itself. These were not empty declarations. They revealed something Africa had rarely seen: an alignment of interests, born not of foreign pressure, but of shared survival. The Sahel, long scarred by insurgencies and manipulation from abroad, suddenly glimpsed a unifying cause: sovereignty under siege. For decades, leaders had bargained in isolation, each trading dignity for scraps of foreign approval. Netanyahu's ultimatum cut through those divisions with a brutality so obvious that it forced a collective answer. By the 45th hour, the African Union convened an emergency session. Normally, its halls echoed with cautious speeches and diplomatic hedging. But this time, the chamber rang with clarity. Ghana's envoy rose first. Any assault on Burkina Faso's sovereignty is an assault on the sovereignty of Africa itself. Nigeria followed. For too long, our survival has been framed as obedience to outsiders. Today, we declare survival means standing with one another. South Africa invoked its own painful past, reminding the chamber of the apartheid years, when isolation was used as a weapon to break resistance. We learned then what Burkina Faso proves: now imposed isolation is not exile, it is independence. Kenya closed with words that electrified the assembly. The age of ultimatums to African governments is finished. Touch one and you face us all. Out of that extraordinary meeting came the Ouagadougou Protocol, named after the very city under siege. Its terms were simple but revolutionary, a pledge that African nations would collectively resist foreign ultimatums, regime change schemes, and coercive diplomacy. Signatories promised coordinated economic responses, united diplomatic pressure, and, if necessary, joint security measures. For the first time since the liberation movements of the 1960s, Africa began to forge a shield not against colonial armies, but against 21st century domination, dressed in contracts and cables. The symbolism was unmistakable. A nation often dismissed as peripheral had become the spark for continental unity. What was meant to isolate Traoré had instead woven him deeper into Africa's fabric, binding his name to a new doctrine of dignity. Outside observers scrambled to reframe the story. Western think tanks muttered about authoritarian contagion. Headlines in Europe and America warned of a dangerous precedent. Yet inside Africa, these words rang hollow. Ordinary citizens saw clearly the precedent was not dictatorship, it was dignity. In Ouagadougou, the president listened to the AU's resolutions. His face betrayed little, but among his ministers, astonishment flickered. The ultimatum had been designed to turn him into a cautionary tale. Instead, it had transformed him into an emblem of resistance. As the final hours ticked down, solidarity erupted across the continent. In Lagos, thousands filled the streets, chanting 48 hours that changed everything. In Nairobi, crowds thundered, "African democracy is not for sale." In Cape Town, students marched beneath banners declaring no more foreign ultimatums. The irony could not be ignored. Netanyahu's demand for silence had instead summoned a chorus of voices louder than any single leader could command. What was meant as intimidation had become ignition. What was designed to showcase control had exposed decline. At the 47th hour, the African Union's resolution was hand-delivered to Ouagadougou. Its message was unambiguous. Any attempt to unseat Burkina Faso's government through foreign coercion would be treated as a direct attack on African sovereignty. Those words carried the weight of a continent rediscovering its voice. The ultimatum had started as a test of one man's courage. It now stood as a referendum on Africa's honor. When the president received the news, he did not cheer or raise a fist. He simply nodded as though acknowledging a truth he had always carried: sovereignty, once awakened, belongs not to a single leader, but to an entire people. And when shared across a continent, it becomes a force that no ultimatum can contain. The countdown continued, but by the time the clock moved toward its final hour, the ultimatum had already collapsed. Africa had shifted, and history was shifting with it. By the 48th hour, the shockwaves had already spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. What began as a midnight confrontation in a small African capital had become a mirror held up to the world. Across the global South, nations, long accustomed to whispered ultimatums and veiled threats, saw their own struggles reflected in the defiance rising from Ouagadougou. The first echoes came from Latin America. In Caracas, President Nicolás Maduro hailed Burkina Faso's stance, calling it a masterclass in how small nations can reject the arrogance of empire. In Quito, Ecuador's government released a statement recalling the day it had torn up foreign oil contracts. "They threatened us too," it read, "but Burkina Faso has proven that threats collapse when a people refuse to bend." Bolivia's president pointed to the continent's battles over lithium, declaring that Africa's defiance was now a shared flag for Latin America's fight to protect its resources. In Asia, leaders who had once spoken with caution now shed their restraint. From Tehran came an offer of cybersecurity support, not as aid but as solidarity. Beijing issued a diplomatic note underscoring its respect for sovereignty, signaling that China was ready to deepen partnerships free from Western strings. Even in New Delhi, commentators spoke openly of a new geometry of global politics being drawn in the sands of the Sahel. But the most surprising surge did not come from governments. It came from ordinary people. In São Paulo, banners stretched across crowded avenues: "Africa's fight is our fight." In Manila, students gathered for forums titled "Resisting Ultimatums in the 21st Century." Social movements that had once focused only inward suddenly recognized a shared script: economic blackmail, media manipulation, cyber sabotage, and more importantly, they recognized the power of simply refusing. Meanwhile, the West scrambled to hold its narrative together. Editorials in major newspapers warned of dangerous defiance and the erosion of global norms. But for many readers, those words rang hollow. On social media, images of vast crowds in Ouagadougou, waving flags and chanting for sovereignty, were set side by side with sterile boardrooms of foreign leaders dictating ultimatums. The contrast was devastating. What was meant to project strength now looked like desperation. Even inside Israel, the ultimatum sparked controversy. Opposition lawmakers demanded answers. Why risk a diplomatic firestorm over contracts in a faraway land? Activists and peace advocates condemned the pressure campaign as a betrayal of democratic values. A petition signed by Jewish communities worldwide declared, "Colonialism in our name is not Judaism in our name." It was a fracture few had predicted, proof that even within powerful states, conscience could still rise against machinery built for domination. Back in Ouagadougou, the president's advisors began cataloging the unexpected alliances forming. Venezuela and Iran offered technical support. China extended economic overtures. Russia initiated strategic consultations. Yet these were not the greatest victories. The real triumphs were intangible: the shifting of psychology, the breaking of inevitability. For decades, the unwritten rule of global politics had been cruelly simple. Small nations could be coerced, threatened, or replaced at will. The crisis in Burkina Faso challenged that law. The ultimatum had not produced collapse, it had sparked defiance. The countdown had not delivered capitulation, it had built solidarity. And within that reversal lay the seed of a new global imagination. Even in Europe, scholars whispered the same recognition. Analysts and think tanks admitted the obvious coercive diplomacy had hit its limit. Ultimatums only work when legitimacy is unquestioned, one paper observed. Once legitimacy shifts to the people themselves, threats lose their bite. What was meant to prove dominance had instead become evidence of decline. By the end of the 48th hour, the outlines of a new alignment were visible. Africa was no longer speaking into a void. Latin America echoed its defiance. Asia nodded in recognition, and activists in Western streets raised banners that blurred the old divides of East and West, North and South. It was not yet a formal alliance on parchment, but it was an alliance in spirit, a fellowship of nations and peoples who had learned the same truth: ultimatums only have power if they are obeyed. As the clock struck midnight, the president of Burkina Faso stepped onto the balcony of his palace. He did not appear as a solitary figure, but as a symbol carried on countless shoulders. The roar that rose to greet him was not just Ouagadougou's. It carried the voices of Caracas and Quito, Tehran, and Manila, Lagos, and Nairobi. It carried the memory of peoples who had endured centuries of threats and now understood a different law of history: dignity moves faster than fear. The ultimatum had failed. But more than that, it had unveiled a forgotten possibility that even the smallest of nations, if they refuse to kneel, can bend the architecture of global power. When the clock struck the 48th hour, a hush swept across Burkina Faso. For a single heartbeat, the nation held its breath. Then, like a tidal wave breaking free, came the sound that would carry far beyond its borders: the thunderous roar of a people who had refused to bow. The ultimatum had expired, and still the president stood tall on the balcony, unshaken, unmoved, unremoved. In that instant, the standoff between two men dissolved into something far greater. Netanyahu's threat shrank to a footnote. Traoré's defiance rose into legend. Across Africa, leaders who had wavered now found their voices. Across the global South, nations, scarred by the same pressures, recognized a new precedent. The ultimatum had not crushed a small landlocked country, it had birthed a doctrine: dignity, once chosen, is beyond negotiation. That doctrine came to be called dignified diplomacy. It proclaimed that sovereignty was never a bargaining chip, that democracy was not a stage play for foreign approval, that ultimatums could no longer script the destiny of entire peoples. It was not anti-Western, it was not anti-Israeli, it was simply and profoundly pro-dignity, pro-sovereignty, pro-human. Months later, the African Union enshrined the Ouagadougou Protocol, pledging collective resistance to political coercion. Years later, African textbooks carry chapters titled "The 48 Hours That Changed Everything." Musicians composed anthems, filmmakers told the story anew, students marched beneath banners that declared in bold paint, "Ultimatums end here." And when historians were asked what lesson had been carved from that storm, they answered with clarity: ultimatums only succeed where fear still rules. But in those 48 hours, fear had been replaced by conviction, and conviction had birthed unity. The balcony moment in Ouagadougou was not the end of the story. It was the opening chapter of a new age, one where even the smallest nations discovered the most powerful word they could hurl against empires the simplest of all know. And in that refusal, the world did not see weakness. It saw freedom. It saw a people choosing to live upright rather than survive on their knees.